Elisabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into one of Hungary's most powerful families. At 15, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, known as the Black Knight, for his brutality in wars against the Turks. Nadasdy taught her torture techniques he used on Ottoman prisoners. When Ferenc died in 1604, Elisabeth inherited Csejte Castle and 17 properties. She was 44 years old with absolute control over 50,000 peasants. Her obsession with beauty led her to beat a servant until bleeding. Seeing that blood softened her skin, she began systematically torturing young virgins. Her accomplices were Dorca, Ilona Jo, Katarina Benica, and Janos Ujvari, who helped her for 6 years. Tortures included needles under nails, red-hot irons, freezing in snow, and blood baths. Count Georgi Thurzo discovered her on December 30th, 1610, with one victim alive, another dying, and 50 bodies in the castle. Testimonies documented 650 murders. Her accomplices were executed, but Elisabeth, being noble, was walled alive in her castle. She died on August 21st, 1614, after 4 years of confinement. If the impunity of the powerful outrages you, subscribe. Because Elisabeth wasn't the last noble who believed her blue blood put her above the law,